Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Tonight our show is broadcasting live from KMUD studios in Northern California, Humboldt County. John Goodiron and me, Mary Massey, are your hosts tonight. Our show is normally broadcast each Monday from the studios of the Mendocino Environmental Center, KMEC Radio. We are friends of KMUD and are delighted to have been invited to participate in the station's online fund drive. The number to call for both listeners to ask questions of our guests and to make a pledge, which we hope you'll do, is 707-923-3911. Make your pledge throughout the hour as we will be having phone volunteers stand by. If you're listening from a live stream, we would ask you to call in at write in at KMUD.org to make your pledge. If you're out of the immediate call area, it's 1-800-568-3723. We will be taking listener calls for each of our two guests during the broadcast tonight. John is joining us via phone. John, are you there? Hello.
Yes, Mary. Good to be at KMUD, People-Powered Radio. We here in northern Mendocino County love our friends at KMUD, and a special call-out for former newsperson Christina Hannestead of KMUD, who also worked at KZYX and is a good friend of KMEC Radio in Mendocino County as well. Welcome to our show.
All righty. Well, tonight we have our guest, Congressman Ron Paul, who is a Libertarian presidential candidate and author. And then during the second half of the hour, John and I will speak with Dr. Ira Helfand. Dr. Helfand was the 1985 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize and has devoted his life to nuclear disarmament. We will begin now with Dr. Ron Paul. Ron Paul is a physician turned politician who served in the U.S. House of Representatives for Texas multiple times. His political ideologies are a combination of libertarian and Republican views. He is an outspoken critic of the federal government's fiscal policies, especially the Federal Reserve and the war on drugs. He served as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force and later with the U.S. Air National Guard. He earned a Doctor of Medicine degree from Duke School of Medicine and specialized in obstetrics and gynecology. He is also deeply interested in economics, which we hope to speak with him about this evening. He is acquainted with economists Hans Seinholz and Murray Rothbard. Dr. Paul has developed his own economic theories. He entered politics and served in the U.S. House of Representatives for Texas' 14th and 22nd Congressional District. He is a former presidential candidate and has authored several books, including The Revolution, a Manifesto, Swords into Plowshares, A Life in Wartime and a Future of Peace and Prosperity, Gold, Peace and Prosperity, and his latest book, The Revolution at 10 Years, which is available now. Dr. Paul, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mary. Nice to be with you.
Very good, very good. We're going to start with a little bit something that happened back in 1976. You established the Foundation for Rational Economics and Education, or FREE, and then just after the Vietnam War. And then more recently, the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, which is a project of the first. Can you tell our listeners why you took steps to develop the center and then the foundation and then the institute, I should say, and how these fulfill your hope of peace and prosperity?
Well, I got involved in politics in the 1970s because there was an anticipation by the free market economists that the whole Bretton Woods system would fall apart and we'd have a lot of economic problems, and I wanted to speak out on that. And the main goal was to speak out, but I wasn't really expecting too much success in being elected because I knew I would not be in mainstream. But that happened. I was elected in a special election in 1976.
Mm-hmm.
And shortly after that, I realized I wanted a vehicle, for the educational process, which was what I was actually really interested in and continue to be. But the political experience I've had has offered me a lot of opportunity to be able to pursue this and present the case for, free markets and individual liberty. So that's when I started Free Foundation, and it's had various emphasis over the years. because it's been a good many years now. Right now, since I've been out of office, it's concentrated on the Institute for Peace and Prosperity, which is just a branch of the Free Foundation, and Daniel McAdams is the executive director of that, and that's where I spend a lot of my educational activities right now.
We were fortunate to have Dan on our program out of KMAC a few weeks ago, and he gave us a lot of terrific information about that. I noticed that the Institute is about what a non-interventionist with respect to foreign policy and politics. Who are we speaking about here as a non-interventionist?
Well, I wish we could talk and point out a few. There aren't too many. There's a few of us. Non-intervention is a favorite word of mine. You know, you have libertarian and all the different factions, but I see politics in terms of intervention or non-intervention. And that has to do with dealing with personal liberty or economic liberty or foreign policy. And really, if you come down and being a non-interventionist, I think all libertarians who have a pretense of being for liberty should be non-interventionist just about every place you can go. And so I use that word a whole lot.
Do you
non-intervention in economics means that you shouldn't have, government managing the economy. You wouldn't have a Federal Reserve. And on personal liberties, you make your own decision what you do with your own body. And on foreign policy, we just don't get involved in the internal affairs of other nations. So to me, it's not complicated. And when I explained this to many of the college students during the campaigns, it seemed like they caught on rather easily.
Mm-hmm, right. And we spoke a little bit about that with Daniel and the sense of intervening in countries and involved in their foreign policy and so forth. So, you're doing great things with that. I wanted to fast forward a little bit. We had President Trump appoint Jerome Powell as the new Fed chairman. What do you think he's going to bring to the mix?
Nothing new. He's been in the Fed for several years now, and the only thing that he could be different on is that he is more dogmatic in not allowing transparency. He actually has gone out of his way to give speeches on why they should never consider the effort I've had in auditing the Federal Reserve. So he's a central banker. He wants more secrecy than the rest. They all want it. But when it comes down to policy will remain the same, and he will be an inflationist and low interest rates, and Trump supports that, obviously, even though Trump gave some support for the auditing the Fed and a little different approach to monetary policy. But he was able to appeal to various groups with different speeches, and then policies don't always follow through. For another instance would be his speeches during the campaign about Russia, the relationship there, and that obviously has changed a whole lot.
Dr. Paul, we're going to invite listeners to call in to speak with you at 707-923-3911 or 1-800-568-3723. And as we get those, we will put them on the air. Switching gears, but related to economy. John, are you there?
Yeah, I was going to see if I could get a question in here.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Paul, this is John Goodiron calling from San Francisco. I'm sorry I couldn't be in the studio. I was settling a $31 million lawsuit here and just had to take care of business, so I'm sorry. But very honored to have you on the show. My question is this. Here in Northern California, we have a very strong Libertarian Party movement. In Mendocino County, our two top law enforcement officers, District Attorney Norm Broman and our Sheriff Tony Craver, 10 years ago, were both members of the Libertarian Party. I believe at one time they were the top elected officials who were libertarians in the United States. What do you see the future of the Libertarian Party to be, particularly in light of the fact that Democrats now, are having a hard time getting control of their own party? You have Donna Brazile writing her book now, alleging that Hillary Clinton stole the campaign from Bernie Sanders. You have Debbie Wasserman Schultz certainly having her hands all over that as well. a lot of credibility problems with the Democratic Party. A lot of Democrats have gone over to the Green Party, to Jill Stein, and voted for her. Mm-hmm. What do you see the future of the Libertarian Party to be going forward in the immediate future?
Well, there's tremendous opportunities. There was a tremendous opportunity last year, but they didn't take advantage of it. So when you see a Bill Weld on the ticket, you have to wonder what's going on. But to tell you the truth, I don't think much in terms of political parties. I never thought my purpose being in the Republican Party and following footsteps and improving the Republican Party, this sort of thing. To me, they blend together in spite of all the fighting and fuming going on with Republicans against Democrats, and then Republicans against Republicans, and Democrats against Democrats, and then the Libertarians get a little bit confused too. I think only in terms of the philosophy they're promoting. I don't think there's that much dissension on issues in Washington. When it comes to the military budget and the military-industrial complex, you get 15 or 20 people really resisting it. Hardly anybody stands up and say we shouldn't be at war. We were able to get success because of public pressure, which is important, to get people in Congress to vote for auditing the Fed. But their heart is not in it. So they move by what the people are thinking, the pressure put on by the people, what the philosophy of the country is, what they've been taught in school. And unfortunately, 90-some% of everybody in Washington has been taught in public, in government schools, and they believe in Keynesian economics. They believe in paper money. They believe debt is good, and it's absolutely necessary for government to be involved in our personal lives, in our economic lives, and they think it's just a sign of tremendous weakness if you don't want to run the world. And but they're all the same. So I don't see. There should be a future for libertarianism and freedom. That's where I'm very optimistic. But when it comes to parties, they seem to just turn me off. But the example that I made with auditing a Fed is the theme that I work on. We had a lot of support and a lot of talk, and the campaign helped, and we'd get a bill on the floor, and the members actually went along and, for political reasons, allowed me to have a vote, and we'd win the vote. But they knew darn well it wasn't going anywhere, but they were responding to the pressure of the people. So the politics is secondary. Nixon once said, after he closed the gold window and got rid of the gold standard, he says, we're all Keynesians now. And he was absolutely right. They're all Keynesians. They're all authoritarians. They're all interventionists. They all like this warmongering. So the people have to change. And this is why I've been attracted to go to the college campuses and hope we get a nucleus of young people that will think differently. I know there's a lot of negative, terrible things going on campuses right now, but I'm still very encouraged about this nucleus that is building, that know and understand what libertarianism, what non-intervention is, and when the revolution comes and is successful, it'll be like the Keynesian revolution. It'll invade all the parties. They will be supported by libertarians and Democrats and Republicans. So I'm really see myself as in the business of trying to change people's minds and attitudes so that eventually the nature of our government will change.
A quick question, a follow-up question. Again, we're broadcasting here from Northern California, where the cannabis industry is very important. And I know you've been very active in the decriminalization of cannabis over the years as a libertarian issue. Care to comment on the growing movement to decriminalize cannabis across the country?
Yes, it's been moving along very well, and I kept using that as an example of changing the people's minds, because I've talked about this for years, and I was always amazed that I could do this in the 1980s and 1990s in a Bible Belt district and still get reelected. But I thought the people were still far ahead of what the Congress was saying. No, I think it's made great progress. I think Trump and Sessions is a big setback for it. And I think it's very important that we continue to do this. because the use of the state nullification, and California helped lead the way. They just decided on some of these laws we shouldn't be doing that, and then they just go about their own business. I love the idea of state nullification as well as jury nullification. Those are supposed to be the last resistance against an authoritarian government. So I think it's a good issue. I feel like we've stepped back, though, this past year because we have moved along. I've always thought what would happen was something like what happened with alcohol. They had this big moralistic move to prohibition of alcohol, and it was a total failure. The people woke up one day, and they said, let's repeal this nonsense, and they repealed it. The only thing amazing about that was they still thought so much about the Constitution, they had to change the Constitution to write such a prohibitive law. But anyway, they woke up and they repealed it, and I think we're in the midst of that now. The people aren't that excited about throwing more people in jail for smoking marijuana. Eventually, I imagine now there's a younger generation that can't believe the type of punishments. But even today, you still have, and Sessions wants to do this. Nonviolent people using drugs for 3 times and convicted could end up in prison for life.
Right.
I mean, it is insanity, and of course, that's where so much of our violence on the streets, the drug gangs and the drug culture. That's what's been one of our biggest problems on law enforcement.
If you'd like to join the conversation, it's 707-923-3911 to talk with Congressman Ron Paul. We are speaking about, in this particular instance, cannabis in Humboldt County and in general. Please give us a call. I wanted to ask about Trump's proposed tax plan. You have looked at economics for a long, long time. How do you feel? How do you feel about it? What do you think is going to happen? How will it play out for those of us in this country?
Well, that was one thing I kept hoping for the best. I've never been convinced. I guess I'm a little bit cynical about the whole thing, that we won't see too much of tax cuts. I think what they can't do is predict the future on what the budget deficit will be like and what the revenues will be like, because all we need is the start of a recession pretty soon, and it all changes. The revenues go down and expenditures go up. Right now, we've just been, they had to pass another bill for $50 billion so the people in California could help bail Texas out from their floods. Mm-hmm. And now Trump is asking for another big boost for the military-industrial complex. So it's always, they make these budgets and they talk about revenues and they always have supplementals. So it's just a charade that they go through, and so many gimmicks. I think the bill that they're just working on now is 300 pages. If you wanted to do tax reform or do something, you just could do that in a couple pages. If they were thinking that maybe it would be good for the country to have a corporate tax rate of 20% instead of 35%, why don't they just write a bill and do it? They don't have an interest in that. It's just all gimmickry go and hide the efforts for some people to escape their taxes. And the one reason they don't really hardly talk about it at all is the big tax is spending. Spending is a tax because it always has to be paid for. And this week I wrote about what the worst tax is, mentioned this in the presidential campaign, and that is the inflation tax. It's regressive, and the lower income people pay for this, and they don't have to pass a tax law to do this. But spending, they could go to the income tax and collect, but this is never enough. They could borrow, and that's never enough. So they dump it on the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve prints it, and the world still loves the dollar, not as much as they used to. They love the dollar. They take the dollar and send us all their stuff, and we get a free ride there. And that's a system that exists, and it's going to continue. So all this is what they're talking about over there, I think, is just deception and how they look best back at home to their constituents. So they have to pretend they're really fighting each other. But believe me, they're not fighting the Fed, and they're not fighting these wars, and they're not fighting welfare. So, but they're fighting all the time, and it's getting pretty serious on the fighting. That's because the country's bankrupt, and they're not willing to admit it.
Wow. Just wanted to mention that we had talked about it before we went on the air about your latest book. You've offered several books, and the latest, which has now been released, is The Revolution at 10 Years. What's the book about?
Well, it's sort of a lot about what we're talking about right now, but it's a takeoff from what happened 10 years ago. In 2007, it was the beginning of the 2008 campaign, and this was sort of something that I had a little bit of ambivalence about getting involved in, but it was going so well, and there was a lot of excitement, so there was a spontaneous fundraising event. It was actually done on December 16th on the Boston Tea Party anniversary, and they raised like $6 million, and it was really a big deal, and it really gave a boost, to the campaign, and the young people were really excited about it, and Giuliani gave us a nice boost and got a little bit of attention for us. So, and that was a real event going on, and people were very excited. But since that time, and then we've had the 12 election, and it got even better. But then people say there'll be articles by libertarians and by the non-libertarians. Well, yeah, that was pretty neat, and that was when the original Tea Party started. But that was taken over by the Republicans, and the Tea Party didn't last very long. And where are they now? Does it exist? And it's really a conditioning to say, well, that movement that was going on back then is dead and gone, and nobody cares. And I disagree with that. My argument is it's alive and well. It's out there. It's more philosophical and political. If you look to Washington, D.C. and the regular communications, you're not going to find anything out there. But if you go and look at what the Mises Institute does and what the Young Americans for Liberty they do, and hopefully we contribute with with our organization of the Organization for Peace and Prosperity, that intellectually we're doing very, very well, and that's what has to come first. You have to change people's mind, and then the government reflects the people. And this idea that if we get 10 more good people in Washington, we should always try to, but it doesn't come from Washington. Washington reflects the people, and I've always thought that that's where the action should be. So people ask me, well, didn't I get awfully frustrated by never getting any bills really passed or changing anything in Washington? But I never was frustrated because that I didn't expect it to happen. I was elated and surprised at the attention the issues that I talked about got. I didn't think that we were that far along, and I don't think we've had a setback, but certainly from the public's viewpoint, there's a setback because there's not enough talk about it, and that's why I still think shows like what you have talking about these issues and talking to people is so important, because I think this is vital. If you can reach even a smaller number of people with what you're talking about compared to MSNBC and all this other stuff on TV, which is nothing but war propaganda, I think we're doing quite well, and the Internet helps us. And I think the attitudes are changing.
I'd like you to, for our listeners, if you would mention where folks can learn more about the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. You have terrific articles. You have I guess you would call it like a video reporting, if you will. You and Dan speak about things. Could you talk about that a little more specifically? And then how folks might be able to get involved besides donating to the Institute?
Yeah, it's Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, and that is a website.org. And you can follow us pretty closely there. But the other thing that you were alluding to is the programming that we do, which is slightly different, but it's almost always involving foreign policy, and Daniel and I do that, and that's the Ron Paul Liberty Report.com. And we actually do a live program every day starting at 11 o'clock Central Time, and we try to pick the important issue of the day, and for tomorrow morning we already picked the subject, which we don't always do the night before, but we want to talk about Saudi Arabia and the big changes going on there, the revolts going on there, and blaming each other. And killing off a bunch of the family, and that's a very, very important area considering the war in Yemen. I think we're on the wrong side of that, but either side is the wrong side as far as I'm concerned. Right. We shouldn't even be over there, and so we do that. But and that's so we like people to go. It's on our program is on YouTube, but the RonPaulLibertyReport.com is where you find the program.
Wonderful. It's 25 minutes past the hour. If you've just joined us, we are speaking with Congressman Ron Paul. And if you would like to, we only have a few more minutes, but if you'd like to make a phone call in, it's 707-923-3911 to either speak with Dr. Paul or make a pledge. John, do you have another question before we need to say goodbye?
Well, I just wanted to thank Congressman Ron Paul for being on the show, and also to have him extend to his son, U.S. Senator Rand Paul, our good wishes. I got to know your son, Dr. Paul, from testimony I gave over the years as a member of UN peacekeeping forces on the Committee on Foreign Relations, on which your son serves, and also testimony I gave on the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs as a national security contractor, and I have nothing but the greatest respect for your son, and I was very sorry to hear of the recent incident in which he was assaulted and injured. So our love goes out to your son. He has he's done you proud in the Senate, and we want to extend to him all our good wishes for his recovery.
Well, thank you very much. And he's doing okay, although he's very, very sore. Yeah. He won't be in Washington this week. We don't know exactly when he'll go back. But he's getting along okay, but with 5 fractured ribs, it's hard to move around, get up and down. He says he does pretty well once he's up. Otherwise, he's still has a lot of healing to do. But that's a mixed-up deal about what happened there. Very bizarre.
Dr. Paul, we have a couple callers on the line. If you could just take one of those right now.
Okay.
Hello?
Very good. We'll give it a try.
Go ahead.
Hello. Yes, I'd like to know how you feel about single-payer health. If you think that all Americans should have health care and we should have a simple single-payer plan so that all the money isn't going for profit to the insurance companies, and money's actually going to health care to help people, survive.
Yeah, well, that's a good idea, and that should be the goal, but it can be developed in the free market. If you do it with government, you get a government monopoly, and that's where Obamacare was moving it to, and that's why it became more expensive. But
if it's in
it was a little bit different than socialized
economy,
medicine. It was corporate
profit.
medicine, and that's, of course, the worst kind in the world. But the market can solve that problem, and we just don't give it a chance. It's just a real shame. What we have now is a total disaster. But most
But at
of our
least if they
history,
have Medicaid for people who can't afford to pay for health care or buy insurance, shouldn't there be a Medicare or Medicaid program to help really poor working people?
Well, there would be, but just so it's voluntary, that's fine.
What do you mean by voluntary?
I'm not that old, and yet I practiced medicine when there was no Medicare and Medicaid. I worked for $3 an hour in an emergency room. Nobody got turned away. We had church hospitals. We still have some of those hospitals. We have a Shriner Hospital here in Galveston. Anybody who has these problems can go in. But this whole thing that the government doesn't have anything. The government has to steal it from somebody. No matter what you want the government to do, they have to steal the money from somebody.
Thank you, caller. We have one more call on the line, please.
Hello.
Go ahead, caller.
Hi. Thank you very much for joining KMUD. Am I still there? Am I on?
You're on.
Okay. I want to thank Dr. Paul for joining the KMUD community, and very, very strongly thank him for being a voice for peace and sometimes kind of a lone voice against a lot of very powerful, rich opposition, which I know can be difficult. So thank you very much for that.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I wanted him to maybe talk about market failures a little bit and ask if he thought there was a role for putting a price on carbon, or how it is that we can ensure that people pay the true, full free market cost of their decisions. And I'll take it off the air. So thank you very much.
Thank you, caller.
Well, that's more complex, and I can't do this in a minute or two, but basically a libertarian should believe that you can't hurt other people. And generally they understand that, but when it gets into the environment, it becomes a little bit more difficult. You have state lines, you have federal, international lines and whatnot, and how can you handle all that? The one thing I do know is that when government gets involved, they play favorites, and even watching this carbon stuff, the rich companies can buy, pay and then pollute themselves and somebody else. It's all a game. But you do not have a right to pollute anybody's air, so it is the pollution and the things that violate the libertarian principle of property rights. But there's a lot of problems with it, because once it becomes politicized, the people who have to pay, or the guilty people who want to get off, it gets to being finger pointing. And believe me, I don't think some of the things I hear in this whole debate, science has settled it. When it comes to these weather change and all that, science hasn't quite settled a lot of things that people say that it's settled. So I think people should have an open mind and look at both sides of all these issues.
Thank you, Congressman Ron Paul. We are delighted that you've been able to join us for these 30 minutes. And again, good thoughts to your son, Rand Paul, and we will all be following what you're doing on your website at the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Thank you and good night.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So we've been speaking.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Again, want listeners to support independent media by supporting KMUD Radio, People-Powered Radio. And if you have a few bucks left over, please support the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. We're the 99% arrayed against that 1% that control everything, and never has the gap between the rich and the rest of us been as wide as it is now. You must support independent media by supporting KMUD Radio and peacemakers like the Ron Paul Institute. Please support KMUD Radio.
So we are at 31 minutes past the hour. If you've just joined us, I'm Mary Massey on the line with John Goodiron. We co-host Heroes and Patriots, and we're having a special broadcast tonight by invitation here at KMUD Community Radio. If you would like to make a contribution to the station, please call 707-923-3911, or you can go to the website if that's easier for you at kmud.org. Coming up in this next half hour, we will be taking listener calls for Dr. Ira Helfand. And he is our next guest. I think we have him on the line. We do not have him yet on the line. Well, let me tell you a little bit about him before we move forward with the show. Dr. Helfand is the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize with International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War. The International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War campaigned for the creation of ICAN beginning in 2006. It successfully launched the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons in 2007. And he is going to draw the connection between older organizations, in other words, the Physician for Social Responsibility and International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and ICAN. So we're, in a way, talking again about peace with Dr. Helfand. We are still getting him on the line, so bear with us. But in the meantime, you can go to the phones and make a pledge at 707-923-3911. Or if you're out of the area, 1-800-568-3723 is the number to call. And to make a pledge online, you may go to kmud.org and do the Donate Now button. A basic membership is $60. Sustaining is $120. $240 for family sustaining. $365 for $1 a day, and then there's also a sliding scale from $12 to $59. So we are still getting we have our guest on the line, and I'd like to go ahead and bring in Dr. Ira Helfand.
Good evening.
Welcome. We finally got you there. Well, we are broadcasting live. John is on the phone if you were not able to listen, and he has questions for you as well, Dr. Helfand.
Yes, I just wanted to thank Dr. Helfand and his and the organizations in which he works for the very, very important work that he does for peace and to fight nuclear proliferation. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War was the recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. We are so honored to have a Nobel Peace Laureate here on KMUD Radio. Again, another reason to support KMUD Radio. Dr. Helfand, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on what seems to be the really wild escalation tensions between North Korea, the United States, but also South Korea and Japan, as they seem to want to join the nuclear arms race as well by developing their own nuclear weapons programs. Where are we on the doomsday clock? How serious is this?
Well, John, good evening. We're in a really bad place, and it's extremely serious. The crisis in Korea has been likened to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and I think that the comparison is not far off. It is a very dangerous situation, and it's not at all clear how this is going to play out. The North Korean regime seems to believe that the only way they can guarantee their security and survival is to build missiles and nuclear warheads with which they can threaten the United States. The U.S. has said this is totally unacceptable and that it will not allow a nuclear North Korea. And at the moment, negotiations seem to have completely broken off. And this leaves us really without any good options at all. So I think this is a very dangerous moment, and it's particularly dangerous that the principal players on both sides seem to be people who really shouldn't be in control of any nuclear weapons at all. And the fact that Donald Trump is the person who is managing this crisis is really quite disturbing. I think the most recent polls show that 2/3 of the American people don't trust him to handle this crisis well. It's a bad situation.
How strong are ties between North Korea and China as it relates to nuclear weapons?
Well, it's a little bit unclear. Historically, China has been North Korea's principal ally. The Chinese clearly are very annoyed with the North Korean behavior, and the North Koreans have sort of gone out of their way to antagonize the Chinese, doing a number of their tests, timing a number of their tests to coincide with major political developments in China so as to upstage those events. I think it's clear the Chinese would prefer the North Koreans to stop their program. They don't want a war on their doorstep, but it's not clear that they have that much leverage over the North Koreans at this point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what do you think Trump's 5-country visit to Asia in the next few days, what do you think will come out of that? Will there be any real input or help from those that he visits?
Well, all the countries that he's visiting would be opposed to the United States launching a preemptive attack on North Korea. South Koreans and the Japanese are going to be right in the line of fire if this happens.
Right.
And I think they're very worried and very concerned that Trump is going to do something precipitous and ill-advised. Whether they can influence him is another question. It doesn't appear that his own Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense have that much influence over his thinking about this issue. But perhaps strongly stated opposition by the Japanese and the South Koreans will temper Trump's enthusiasm for a military solution, which is the path he seems to be pursuing at this point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you, just going back, we mentioned, I think, before we had you on the phone that you are a part of social responsibility in physicians and preventing nuclear war. How is that organization? How is it, affecting affecting change, I guess, and meeting its goals? What's happening on that front?
Well, aside from the immediate crisis in Korea, there's been an enormous uptick in interest in the nuclear weapons issue over the last several years. in response to the events in Korea, to Trump's election, to the ongoing very dangerous situation in South Asia between India and Pakistan, and to the growing tensions between the United States and Russia. And for the first time in a generation, really, people are focusing on the nuclear weapons issue and are open to hearing about the urgent need to eliminate these weapons. For a long time after the end of the Cold War, the big problem that we faced was simply inattention. People thought the nuclear problem had gone away, even though it hadn't, and therefore weren't very interested in talking about it. But there's been a great deal of increased interest in this issue recently, and it's incumbent upon PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and other groups that are trying to eliminate nuclear weapons to really take advantage of this increased receptivity on the part of the public to lead a discussion about this issue that focuses on the terrible danger that these weapons pose, the unbelievable humanitarian consequences that will result from the use of these weapons, and the urgent need, therefore, to get rid of them before something catastrophic happens. And
I was looking at your website. Is there a way that folks can, those of us that are upset about this, how can we help affect change as citizens?
Well, there are a couple of pieces of legislation that are pending right now. On the House side, there's the legislation introduced by Congressman Liu from Los Angeles, and on the Senate side by Senator Markey from Massachusetts, that would make it illegal for the president to launch a nuclear attack without congressional authorization unless the United States were attacked first. And this is a very valuable piece of legislation that people can and should support, and they should be in touch with their senators and congressional representatives and urge them to support this legislation. Beyond that, there are going to be initiatives to try to get the United States to take its weapons off hair trigger alert, so they can't be fired in a matter of moments, to declare a no first use policy, that is to say the United States will agree not to use nuclear weapons first, something which it has not been willing to do. And there's going to be a big fight over the next couple of years about the budget. The Trump administration is building on a proposal that came from the Obama administration, is now proposing to spend something like $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years, enhancing every element of our nuclear arsenal. And this is a really inappropriate and counterproductive expenditure of money, and people can and should be urging their congressional representatives to oppose these new expenditures. But beyond that, I think we need to really be mobilizing over the next 3 years to bring about a complete transformation of American nuclear policy. I mean, we face a fundamental decision now. We can either go the route of the $1.1 trillion enhanced nuclear arsenal, or we can truly commit to pursuing an agreement among the other nuclear weapon states, with the other nuclear weapon states, to eliminate all nuclear weapons. And this is what we need to do. The Trump administration is quite unlikely to pursue that course, but there will be a new administration in power in January of 2021, and we need to create the conditions so that that administration comes into office committed to truly seeking a world free of nuclear weapons, not just at a rhetorical level, but actually having that as a policy of the United States government.
If you'd like to join the conversation, we are speaking with Dr. Ira Helfand. The number to call and ask questions is 707-923-3911 or out of the area 800-568-3723. What would be the humanitarian consequences of a conflict in South Asia or India or Pakistan?
Well, one of the things that I think has really driven concern about nuclear weapons in recent years is the new understanding, that a war between India and Pakistan would not just have terrible consequences there in South Asia. The consequences there would be terrible. If even a small portion of the Indian and Pakistani nuclear arsenals were used against urban targets, as many as 20 to 30 million people could die in the first week from the explosions and the fires and the radiation. But what we have learned in recent years is that those fires, started by those bombs, would put enormous amounts of soot into the upper atmosphere, blacking out the sun and causing worldwide climate disruption that would cause a dramatic decline in food production across the planet and precipitate a worldwide famine that could put up to 2 billion people around the planet at risk of starvation. This information, is the result of studies that have been done by climate scientists and some work by physicians of social responsibility over the last decade. And it has really, I think, cast the entire nuclear question in a new light. We used to think that only a war between the United States and Russia would be a global event. But now we understand that even a limited nuclear war between smaller nuclear powers, like India and Pakistan, would be absolutely devastating across the entire planet.
If you're just joining us, go ahead, John.
Barry, I was wondering if I could get a question in with our 1985 Nobel Peace Laureate, Dr. Ira Helfand of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Dr. Helfand, there has been a trend in the technology and modernization of our nuclear arsenal to miniaturize nuclear weapons. So it seems out of vogue now to be building up a big strategic arsenal on ICBMs, etc. And the tactical use of nuclear weapons where you could dial down the detonation to a fraction of a megaton, etc., in the view of some, would make the use of tactical nuclear weapons more acceptable. This, of course, represents a huge threat to global health. Because an escalation from tactical nukes to strategic nukes is almost certainly will be the case. Do you want to talk about this trend towards the miniaturization of tactical nuclear weapons and what the implications are?
Well, I think you got it just right, John. The driving force behind this technological quest is a desire to make nuclear weapons more usable, to create nuclear weapons that can, in fact, be used. And it's a terribly dangerous development because the firewall that has existed since Nagasaki, the general sense that it is absolutely prohibited to use nuclear weapons, has been incredibly valuable. It has been much of what has stood between us and catastrophe. And if that firewall is eroded, if we develop weapons which seem usable, the chance that, in fact, we will use them and cross that firewall is very great. And as you suggested, once we cross that firewall, the slope from tactical nuclear weapons to strategic nuclear weapons is very slippery indeed. And I think it is almost inevitable that if nuclear weapons are used, we'll progress to the use of larger nuclear weapons. There really needs to be an absolute prohibition on any use of nuclear weapons. And
thank you.
One thing I would say, though, is beyond that, is that it is not just the small weapons that are being enhanced in this buildup that the Trump administration is calling for. We are going to build new submarines to carry our Trident missiles, new intercontinental ballistic missiles to carry large warheads, and a new fleet of bombers to carry large cruise missiles and other nuclear weapons.
Israel has kind of pioneered the miniaturization of tactical nukes. Does your organization follow developments in Israel very closely?
No, developments in Israel are pretty hard to follow. The Israeli government does not acknowledge that it has a nuclear arsenal, even though it clearly does.
Of course.
We do have we have an affiliate in Israel, and ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, also has a very active group in Israel, which is campaigning very hard for Israel, like the other nuclear weapon states, to give up their nuclear weapons.
And so the argument that the United States seems to carry is that nuclear weapons are necessary for national security. Can you speak to that? I mean, we know that President Trump is well, we all know about that. But can you speak to the idea that they're necessary for? Yeah.
This is a very powerful and important argument. Many people in this country believe that nuclear weapons make us safe, that somehow or other they guarantee that no one will attack us that somehow magically these weapons have some special quality that guarantees they'll never be used.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is that's not true. We've been very lucky on the many occasions when we have come close to nuclear war. But it's not because of any inherent quality of nuclear weapons or because of the wise doctrines or leadership of people in charge in either the United States or Moscow. It's because we've been lucky. And the fact is that the greatest threat to our safety and security is posed by these very weapons. And so it is really incredibly important that we get rid of them. Not just ours, but all the nuclear weapons in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that we can do that is if we are willing to give up our own weapons as well. These weapons pose an existential threat to human survival. There's no other weapon ever built by man that poses that same kind of threat. And to maintain these weapons, knowing what they can do to human civilization if they're used, is just an unacceptable risk. So, can the United States disarm unilaterally? No, it can't and probably shouldn't. It needs to enter into an agreement with all of the nuclear weapon states.
Mm-hmm.
And those negotiations are not going to be easy, but they are absolutely essential. There really is no alternative.
And to your knowledge, is a conference or a whatnot being planned for such a thing, or is someone leading that effort that all states would come together and talk about this, including the United States?
Well, there was negotiated this past summer at the United Nations the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and it was approved by a vote of 122 to 1. And it calls on all nations to give up their nuclear arsenals and to refrain from testing, from developing, from financing, from transporting nuclear weapons in the future. It is potentially a framework that could be used, but none of the nuclear weapon states have signed on to this treaty. I think that the next step will probably be not for them to sign this treaty, but for the existing nuclear weapon states to sit down in separate negotiations, because they are going to have to work out a number of details about the verification and the enforcement of any agreement that they reach. And that whole set of negotiations is going to need to take place multilaterally amongst the several nuclear states to create the conditions which would then allow them all to sign on to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Those negotiations among the nuclear weapon states have not started. They're not immediately on the horizon. They are the challenge for the next U.S. administration. That has got to be its most important policy objective, to achieve that agreement. And it needs to provide great leadership, because it's not going to be easy to get those negotiations going.
What did you make of Trump's not certifying or recertifying Iran's back, 3 weeks ago, and leaving things up to Congress? What do you think what message did that send, do you suppose?
Well, it's hard to know, obviously, because Trump, it's not clear what Trump is thinking at any moment in time. But the message of not certifying basically raises the possibility that this very important agreement will unravel. Trump didn't impose new sanctions, but he opened the way for Congress to do that. And if Congress does impose new sanctions, there's every indication that the Iranians will withdraw from the agreement and resume their nuclear program, which is the last thing that the United States should want.
Right.
This was an extremely stupid move on Trump's part. It is hard to understand what he was thinking. It was opposed, I believe, by almost all of his advisors. And as is the case with so many of the things he does, it is just hard to know what was going on in his mind.
Right. We're speaking with Dr. Ira Helfand. He is the past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility and co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. He is the recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. And you're still practicing medicine, are you not, in Springfield?
I am, yes. I work full-time as a physician. And my organization, which was actually the recipient of the prize, it was awarded to IPKNW, continues to work in 60 countries around the world, including through Physicians for Social Responsibility here in the United States, trying to build the movement that we need to change U.S. nuclear policy. And we are really happy that a bunch of activist groups around the country are coalescing around a new campaign here in the United States that's modeled on the freeze campaign of the 1980s, which people may remember.
Mm-hmm.
This campaign is called Back from the Brink, a call to prevent nuclear war. And it is based on a simple statement of what U.S. nuclear policy should be,
mm-hmm.
that there should be no first use, that we should take our weapons off hair trigger alert, that the president should not have the ability to launch nuclear war on his or her own authority, that we should not spend $1 trillion on enhancing our nuclear arsenal, and that we should enter into negotiations with the other nuclear weapon states to eliminate all nuclear weapons. Those 5 points have been incorporated into a simple statement which, like the freeze, we will be taking to organizations all around the country, city councils, town meetings, state legislatures, unions, professional organizations, faith communities, urging them all to endorse this statement and thereby to create, in the same way the freeze movement did, a national movement for a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear policy.
Dr. Helfand, we have a caller who would like to ask you a question if
Sure.
we can. Caller, go ahead. You're on the air. Caller, go ahead. Caller, are you there? Well, we don't seem to have the caller on the air. Anyway, go ahead and finish your thought. I'm sorry to interrupt him.
No, I was just going to say, I think this statement can be, this call to prevent nuclear war can be a tool in the same way that the original freeze was, that everyone in the country who wants to do something about nuclear weapons can work with. We can all take this statement to any organizations that we have contact with
mm-hmm.
and urge them to join in this national call for new nuclear policy.
And where can folks see that in writing or share that? How can they do that?
This is going to get rolled out in the next week,
mm-hmm.
and will be coming up on the websites of a number of national organizations, including Physicians for Social Responsibility. And in the meantime, people can go to the PSR website, www.psr.org, for information about all of the activities that PSR is engaging in around the country.
We think we have our caller back. Go ahead, caller. Caller?
Hi.
Go ahead.
So my question, one of them is, what do you think the value of missile defense technology is in terms of reducing the threat of nuclear weapons to human civilization in general? And a couple comments also as far as the
we only have a few minutes,
East,
please.
Nuclear policies. For one, I don't think it's really fair at all to kind of single out Israel is like one of the primary.
Your question, please.
Did you get my question?
Yes, and
about the missile defense.
All right, thank you, caller. Dr. Helfand?
Yeah, two things. So first of all, I don't think it's fair to single out Israel either. Israel is one of 9 nuclear weapon states, and they all need to get rid of their nuclear weapons, including Israel, but also the other 8. I do think that missile defense has played basically a very negative role in efforts to end the nuclear weapons era. It's not a reliable system. It would take very few warheads getting through the United States to inflict unacceptable damage on our country. And no system that we build is likely to be anywhere near 100% effective. Unfortunately, what has happened is that missile defense plans, going all the way back to the 1980s, have tended to sabotage efforts to actually eliminate nuclear weapons. The United States and the Soviet Union almost agreed on a treaty to eliminate all nuclear weapons in the mid-1980s.
Right.
But President Reagan, unfortunately, insisted on maintaining a missile shield, as he called it, and the Russians, the Soviets, would not go along with that. And the whole enterprise, which could have ended the nuclear weapons era, foundered. At the moment, the U.S. missile defense system that's been put in place in South Korea is viewed by the Russians and the Chinese both as a threat to their countries, and it's really undermining our efforts to get them to cooperate with us to put pressure on the North Koreans.
Thank you, Dr. Helfand. I'm sorry we're out of time, but I wanted to, again, just if you would lead that website one more time for folks to keep an eye on things.
Sure, it's www.psr.org. PSR for Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being our guest today, Dr. Ira Helfand.
Thank you, Dr. Helfand. God bless you. The world is a better place with you in it.
It's been a pleasure being with you tonight. Thanks so much for letting me speak with your listeners.
All right. Bye-bye. Dr. Ira Helfand is a past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility and co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and a recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. He practices medicine at the Family Care